like Bengali, Assamese, or Gujaratis. So for him, a tribe is not a mere socio-cultural community. Rather, tribe is a whole society like any other society with their own language, their own sense of territory, culture, custom, and so on. Hence, as societies, tribes must be compared with other societies and not with the castes, as has been the case in the sociological and anthropological writings. So, in the parlance of these tribal studies, till about the 1990s, sociological and anthropological writing on tribes in India heavily foregrounds the theoretical framework of civilizational evolutionary perspective, wherein caste society is seen as a civilized core and tribes as uncivilized periphery. Andre Bete, for example, articulate that tribes exist outside the ambit of the structure of state and civilizations. So the category tribes in India are in fact entangled and seep into the fabric of this perversive caste society. Kaka, for instance, pointed out that tribes have been seen as natural equivalents to of castes. A contrast has been drawn between tribe and caste. And even change is argued among tribes has primarily studied in terms of its transformations into castes. On a similar note, Bankia Bukia is a history professor, aptly observed that much conceptual brutality has been committed over the year by the like of, say, A.C. Roy, G.S. Gore, N.K. Bose, Andre Bete, and strings of other upper caste social anthropologists who tried to lock Adivasi/last tribes within a subterranean Brahminical framework. So the caste-centric theorizations of tribes, in the words of Bodhi, has bounded tribes under the rigid wave of colonial frames that infantilizes and deny agency to tribal society. Conceptually, I echo this Kaka's theory of tribes, wherein tribes are not a mere socio-cultural community, but also a politico-historical entity. And with time, we'll move on to a new stage, such as a nation, nationality, or nationhood. So tribes are a whole society, each with its own language, culture, custom, tradition, and so on. So tribes in India, of course, have a social structure which is different from the so-called mainstream society. If we look at 2011 census, there are about 705 individual ethnic communities identified as settled tribes and constitute 8.6% or 104.3 million people of the total populations of India. So the use of the term tribe, in fact, is fraught with certain difficulties in Northeast as elsewhere also in India. It tends to generalize, communities that are quite different from each other in respect to language, culture, tradition, so on. So amidst these differences, Kaka draws out one commonality of tribes in India, that is exclusions from many social groupings that have historically, socially, and culturally been associated with India. In terms of the diversity of tribal population, you can see the tribes can also be differentiated on the basis of population size, since communities like, Gonds, Pils, Santals, Oron, Minas, Mundas, and so on have a population that ranges from 1 million to little over 7 million people. As against this, there are communities like the Andamanis, Islander, and tribal groups such as, Brijas and Ashurid in Bihar and the Bihur of Madhya Pradesh, whose population is in fact less than 200 people. So one also has to be a little bit careful in terms of treating tribe as a homogeneous category, because tribe is not, in that case, not a homogeneous. Even in terms of the population, it differs very big. In terms of culture, in terms of lived experience, in terms of encounter with various development projects, it varies that. As one reading about these on tribes, two dominant perspective, which we see is that of the Western or evolutionary perspective and that of this caste perspective. Here, I would like to depart little bit from that of this caste or this evolutionary perspective and involve this what the tribal intellectual collective India theorized tribes as a noun caste society. So TSCI's theorized tribe very different from that of the so-called mainstream scholars. For them, there is a clear distinction in terms of studying and understanding tribes in India, and they examine from the framework of pre and post Khaka framework. Basically, they foreground heavily on what Professor Virginus Khaka's theory of tribe marketed differed from other scholars. For instance, in pre-Khaka framework, one look at the singular narratives of this Indian modernity stemming from the social evolutions of caste society. Here, caste society is seen as a greater, all-embracing tradition, while tribes are seen as smaller traditions that will fit in due course of time get accidentally subsumed or willingly merged into a caste society. So here, what I mean, when we talks about this post-Kaka framework, it recognizes there is a waves of colonialism taking place that are layered into the reality of society in India and that are sharply observable among tribal societies. The waves of colonialisms framework reject other premises such as post-colonialism, new colonialism or semi-colonialism and colonialism as a fundamental premises for analyzing Indian reality. So TSCA, for instance, also looks about an alternative path to modernity that is experienced by societies inclusive of the tribes as against a singular path to modernity as defined and experienced by the dominant caste society. So tribes in Kaka's perspective would be conceived can be conceived as noun caste society, each on their own path to modernity. So when we really question the very notions of modernity here, the question, whose modernity are we talking about? Is there only one way of modernity, or there are also alternative ways of modernity to reach that aspect? Here, for that matter, TSCA looks at there is an alternative path to modernity, and on the concepts of governance, and on the concept of development.
Is it this?
I think he's,
His, yeah, I think he's got disconnected. Is it? Or the
yes, I think he's just
maybe the
joined right
connection
now,
is
maybe.
weak. Yeah.
Um, I'll just text him or call him. Yeah.
Hi, Gurmeet. Hi. I think he'll rejoin. He's just left, so maybe he'll rejoin. Yeah.
I think he's joined. I think he's joined.
It hardly happened. I don't know why. Then my network got disconnected today. So it was strange. I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry. So well, yeah. Talking. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes, Dr. Ziipao, you're audible.
Okay. I was bringing up about the post-Kaka framework, particularly which the TSCA has been theorized, the concepts of modernity, the concepts of development, and I'm talking about the current development paradigms as these empowering, arising from this caste society in a way that denial agency to certain communities. So here, what is needed is sustainable, holistic development with equity stemming from within tribal communities. And also in the realms of this knowledge production, one is fundamentally grounded on a historical approach that accept epistemologies. Here I'm looking at referring to that plural rather than a single epistemology in singular in terms of producing knowledge. So to me, the connotations, concept, category, or uses of the term tribe is markedly different from what is commonly understood in Europe or the Western or the caste-centric anthropological writings, which categorize tribes as savage, barbarian, backward people, or people without history, among others. So conceptually, tribe is a noun caste society in India, and people with a distinct history, culture, tradition, identity, autonomy, sense of boundary, and so on and so forth, and also waves of victims of several waves of colonialisms. I thought I'll play a short video, but I'm not very sure now. My network might not permit. So, nevertheless, I'll just continue. Here, on the context of the land, which in fact I was trying to play the video on, the songs of resistance, wherein the tribes are singing, we will not leave our village, nor our forest, nor our mother earth. We will not give up our fight. They build factories and cut down forests and, build centuries. So the fundamental question with the song asks us is that without land, water, and forest, where do we go? That is a fundamental question which the songs invoke. In fact, World was listening to that. And in fact, they said, oh God of development, pray tell us how to save our lives, So here, the question of land and identity and also tribal survival, in fact, is closely linked and tangled together. For instance, Bodhi and me theorize land as being alive. We posit that the land, often being the foundational base, is conceived as being alive. The language, culture, and tradition manifesting from land are dynamic and alive. Territory, which is generally holistic, constitutes hills, rivers, natural and mineral resources, air, water, and people who firstly inhabit it. So each of these processes is conceived fundamentally as sublime living entities, all living, dynamic, and changing. So tribals have an intrinsic symbiotic connections between their identity, land, and territory. In terms of various approaches or perspective, broadly, there are two dominant perspectives concerning tribal studies in academia in South Asia. That is one is that the colonial anthropologies or Western nationalist caste-centric perspective, which one can call as perspective from above. And the subaltern studies approach that takes the forms of this perspective from below. The emerging perspective, as theorized by this DSA, came to be known as perspective from within, which scholars with the decolonization theory, Bodhi for that matter, posited that perspective from within gives a space for a respectful engagement across fluid community boundaries, yet propel researchers to search, locate, and position themselves around the ability to occupy a point of view firmly grounded from within rather than from without. So here I was reminded of the work by this Grossfogel, where he reiterated decolonial perspective cannot be based on an abstract universal, that is one particular that raise itself as universal global design, but would have to be the result of the critical dialogue between diverse critical epistemic project towards this what is called this pluriversal as opposed to this universal world. So drawing on the experience from indigenous people in South America assert concepts such as perspectivisms and decolonial thinking. In North America, the focus is on decolonial method. Well, indigenous scholars from South Africa engage with decolonization and indigenization process. So, for example, the Maoris of New Zealand, especially the writing of this Linda Tuiwa Smith, posit decolonizing methodology as the way forward. Indigenous people from Australia assert truth-telling, healing, and decolonization of the stolen generation by the colonizers. And here, this seminal work of this Boaventura dos Santos, which he thought titled Epistemologies of the South, Justice Against Epistemicides, gives an emancipatory approach to knowledge production and depart from the Eurocentric critical tradition. So keeping in mind about these indigenous assertions or indigenous studies across the globe, coming back to the context of Northeast, how do we look at that? What perspective do we draw in order to understand the social reality of varied tribal communities in the context of Northeast? So Northeast, in fact, is often projected as a single entity woven in the mosaic of ethnic tribal societies from a touristic point of view. However, this is far from reality. Demographically speaking, tribes in Northeast India constitute only 27% of the region total populations. To illustrate, for instance, Arunachal Pradesh tribal population comprises only 68.8% of the total population. Assam only 12%, Manipur 35, Meghalaya 86, Mizoram 94, Nagaland 86, Sikkim 33, and Tripura like 31%. There are also like numbers of tribes which are inhabited in the context of the Northeast. For instance, in Arunachal Pradesh, we have this Adi, Apatani, Nishi, Kamti, Singpos, and Mompas. If it comes to Assam, we have this Bodos, Kacharis, Karbi, Rabas, and Misin. And in the Mizoram, we have this Lusai, Ralte, Mar, Paite, Chakmas. Similarly, in Meghalaya, we have Khasi, Garo, Chantias. In Manipur, we have this Aimol, Anal, Chote, Gante, Inpui, Pumai, Tangkul, Mao, Marams, Similarly, in Tripura, we have the Tripuris, Riang, Notias, and Chakmas. Nagaland, of course, like Ao, Zangamis, Lotas, Sumis, Konya, Chakashans, Kemugan, Pong, Puchuris, so on and so forth. So given these very diversity in terms of tribes, even in Northeast India, how do one really understand this complexity, the complex social reality? That is one of the reasons why I'm positioning that we need an alternative, different perspective to understand tribe or to understand social reality in the context of Northeast India. So tribes in Northeast, as elsewhere in the country, are or we are experiencing a waves of colonialism. Or in other words, there is a layers of colonial power imposed in themselves. The first layer fundamentally took place with the British. In the pre-British period, what is today commonly known as the Northeast India consisted of various kingdoms and independent village republic, which call its village state, ruled by various kings and chiefs. Geographically and politically, the region falls into two broad categories, namely the hills and valley. The hilly regions, predominantly inhabited by tribes, were neither ruled by the kings nor followed the monarchical systems. They had their own systems of autonomy and were self-governed. For instance, Roy Burman argues that the hills were outside the control of the valley administrations, and they flourished more or less as independent regions. So if we historicize a bit and look at tribes, one will find that invasions and expansion of kingdoms were part of the history of the regions as elsewhere in the country. So for instance, Burma was a rising power in the early 19th century, making a repeated invention into the Ahom and the Manipuri kingdoms. This led the Ahom and Manipuri kings to seek assistance from the British East India Company, which was then based in Calcutta and had already established the Bengal presidency in 1765. So British India, in fact, responded, and in preparation for the first Anglo-Burmese war, roads were constructed for military campaign in the regions. The Burmese army were defeated in war, which eventually led to the signing of the Treaty of Yandabo in 1826. So this treaty between the East India Company and the King of Ava brought to an end the Burmese invention and occupation of Assam, Manipur, Kachar, and Jantel kingdoms. Thus, the treaty officially, in fact, paved the way for colonial rule in the regions. So mention made that the King of Manipur entered into a formal relationship with the British by signing the first Treaty for Defense Alliance. It was on 14 September 1762. Henceforth, various Manipur kings colluded and worked in close alliance with the British throughout the colonial period. Theoretically, for instance, Manipur was an independent kingdom until 1891. But for all defense purposes, it depended on the British government through the political agent situated in the kingdom. So the colonizations and territorialization of the northeastern states and their resources were streamlined with the construction of roads. So roads for territorial expansion and resource extraction were the core agendas of the British East India Company. So here, talking about the first process, how do one look at about the concept of tribes? There is a panoplies of laws and acts being passed during the British time. So one among such regulation was what is called the Eastern Bengal Frontier Regulation Act of 1873. This regulation introduced a concept like inner line permit that demarcated a line between the plains and the foothills of Assam. The entry of both tribal and non-tribal beyond that line required permissions from a competent British authority. So this was the beginning of divisions between the hills and valley. Today, an inner line permit was required by non-tribal to enter the state like Mizoram, Arunachal, and Nagaland. So the colonial policy of non-interference in dealing with the hill communities was replaced by regular expeditions to quell the opposition to the colonial extension of commercial activities in and through their land. Simrai, for instance, pointed out that eventually the hill communities that were brought under the different territorial administrative authority, and thus the concepts of these territorial politics was introduced, hitherto unknown to these communities. So the colonial rule, in fact, further introduced concepts such as backward trades, excluded areas or partially excluded areas by passing the Government of India Act, order in 1936. So it was the British who redefined space, landscapes, forests, and infrastructure, and they created many categories such as like hills, valley, frontiers, partially excluded areas, administered areas, and political agent, among others. So if we look at historically, all the hill territories, with the exceptions of a small area in Shillong, were demarcated as either partially excluded or excluded areas by the British India. Hence, it was the British who created the binary between the hills and valley on the basis of geospatial differences, civilization, culture, and tradition. So the geographical location of various communities in Northeast India, in fact, invariably fits into Scott's argument about Southeast Asia, wherein the tribe like Nagas, Mizos, Garos, Khasis, etc., in his turn, would form a noun state space, an illegible space from the perspective of the state in the lowlands. So today, the region is experiencing the ramifications of these colonial geopolitics. This has a bearing on infrastructure. It has a bearing on a sense of belonging, territories, boundaries, culture, and so on and so forth. The communities that later came to be known as scheduled tribes in India, and more specifically, hill people in Northeast India. So having historicized a bit, I want to focus on, for developmental state and tribes in Northeast India. So if we look at various development projects or Indian state approach, say for instance, the Indian developmental state during the Nehru year was seen primarily as engines of production, especially active in the production of essential industrial capacities and in creating infrastructure. However, the Nehruvian state that embarked on this rapid industrialization and infrastructure development also led to disempowerment of certain communities in India in the forms of displacement and dislocation, particularly tribes in India. So if we look at the data between 1951 and 1990, this is from the Government of India data. Development projects such as like dams, mine, factories, and wildlife sanctuaries are estimated to have displaced our 21 million people. Of the total number of displaced, as many as above 8 million people have been enumerated as tribals. So tribals people have thus come to consider as much as 40% of the displaced population. Even they comprise just above 8% of the total populations. So in the lights of this India's development experience in post-economic reform, especially concerning tribe, the state, in fact, effectively played a corporate role in deepening their profit-driven extractive resources in tribal belt and trampling the process of every safeguard and protection provided in the constitutions and law. For instance, Kaka termed this as a coercive development. He pointed out that if tribals cooperation is not forthcoming, coercion and violence are the means through which the state development agenda is to be pursued. So the interest of the Indian state in securing the Northeast, in fact, has activated various infrastructural projects, among which, like road construction, hydropower project, international fencing are the key elements. It plays into the service of, Indian military for road construction and other development projects in regions. So the constructions of the frontier highways in Arunachal Pradesh, fencing the Indo-Myanmar border, the constructions of mega dam in Arunachal Pradesh in Manipur, the trilateral highways, fencing the Indo-Myanmar border, among others, a pointer in this case. The list, in fact, goes on. So commenting on the state project in Northeast India in the backdrop of what has been rechristened as Egg East policy and this sub-regional transnational connectivity, Srikanth in fact pointed out that infrastructure roads are built not so much to connect villages, roads, and cities, but to facilitate speedy movements of goods and services within and across the country by conceiving the shortest road and train roads possible, linking cities with industrial corridors, seaports, and airports. So the development policies and project in Northeast as initiated by the Indian state foregrounds heavily on security approach, or in other words, strategies for counter-insurgency and new liberal market-driven motives for transnational engagement as opposed to that of the people-centric approach. In this context, it is quite interesting to observe and to see about the so-called India's Egg East policies. Say in Nagaland, for instance, Yellow Voter was theorizing that Nagaland developmental was used to co-op and corrode the perceived internal traits of Naga insurgency, unlike its neighboring states, where nationalized space was embarked upon to counterweight the external threat posed by China. So looking about these various development projects and its implication in the context of Northeast and that of the tribes, where my research also focused a bit on what I call this infrastructure of injustice, wherein, those certain projects were created, but what are the utilities of such projects? For instance, I always quote the example of the Kuka Dam in the context of Manipur. It spends more than 27 years to build that particular dam, spend more than 300 crore. But utility of that dam is just a fishing and a picnic spot. Such kind of infrastructure, which I term that as infrastructure of injustice. Many villages were being displaced. Many people were rendered as they lost their livelihood. They have lost the control over the land. But in fact, when we look at about the utility of such infrastructural projects, it's only acting as a picnic spot, acting for a fishing spot. So also the highways, those are the construction highways, those highways that bypass the local economy, that can be termed also as infrastructure of injustice. So if you're interested, we can discuss this more, wherein I look into, three concepts: infrastructural injustice, infrastructure of injustice, and also infrastructural deficits. And also particularly, I wanted to end this talk by discussing a little bit on the concepts of the methodology. How do one engage the very questions of tribes, particularly in the Northeast India? What methods do we employ to study or to understand the social reality, the complex social realities, marked by chronic social conflict? One might wonder, it says that, okay, one way to study is, by employing the concept called or methodological ethnography. And one of the methods of ethnography, what is called this participants' observations. So the question is, what happened when I, as a researcher, become my own object or subjects? What happened when you research around communities? So here there is a very interesting concept which a tribal intellectual collective in India called this engage observations, wherein you work towards such an extent that the subject objects becomes very blur. You are drawn into the reality of that subject or into that reality if where you are studying. That's where you could make a distinct observation be part of that very aspect. So having said this, in fact, Bodhi and I, we also try to argue something, in the context of like integrations or what other things. We were arguing, placing forward what is all this, what is the need of the R for the tribals, particularly like in the Northeast or other parts of the country, is that we need these, what is called epistemological integrations. There has already been, in terms of territorial integration, has already achieved. Political integration, tribes already become a nation, the part of this state. So here, what is required is called this epistemological integration. So what does we mean by these epistemological integrations? So this epistemological integration is to be understood as a search for recognition and respect for the totality of a community's being, which include a theoretical acceptance of its history, a legal recognition of its habitat, a social respect of its culture, and also a political willingness to see and treat the community as equal and self-determining. That's what we mean by epistemological integration. That is what the tribe as a whole in that matter needs in context of this recognition or recognition of their very existence of the being. Okay, with this, I think I'll stop here. We can have some more time for the discussions and comments and questions. So I hope I provoke you, some of you. So that is what's also one of the objectives. So we can have a discussion further here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, for the extremely enlightening and intriguing session. Now we will be moving on to the question and answer session. And for that, I would like to introduce Shobha, who will be our moderator for this question hour.
Thank you, Kim, and a very good evening to everybody. My name is Shobha, and I'm from BA History Honors Department first year, and I'll be your moderator for today. And we now move on to short question and answer session. And out of all the questions, I will be taking few of them. I request all the participants to please write down their questions in the chat box. Okay, so we have one question from Denley. He's asking that, how has the processes of globalization influenced the idea of tribe in India in contemporary times?
Should I go ahead and try to respond this or wait for other questions?
Sir, you may go ahead and answer this.
Well, yeah, in fact, this is quite interesting questions, and I might not have a direct answer for that, but nevertheless, I can reflect a bit. If we look at the wave of these new liberal aspects, the wave of these new waves of new liberalism has seeped into every corner. If you look at be it in the tribal areas or be it in the caste-centric areas, the way we conceive the very idea of modernity, the way we conceive development also has changed. Say, for instance, look at the context and notice Article 371 A, B, C, D. Why are all those articles been in existence? The way, how this globalization has also influenced the way our social reality has approached to northeastern states, or for that matter, the questions of tribes. There are different paradigms. The first paradigm, what is called is cultural paradigms. There's the political paradigms. There is the security paradigms. But in 1990s, there was a dramatic change wherein they look at from the development paradigms. The mantra of development will solve all the issue of insurgencies. The mantra of development will solve the questions of ethnic conflict. That's how the state envisaged, and that's how the idea of tribes are also being seeped into it. But nevertheless, the very category tribe stands as it is. And if we foreground the very concept or, under the shadow of the caste, we will not able to understand the very meaning or the insights of the existence of the category tribes. No doubt about it, the processes of globalization have influenced the idea of development, the idea of modernity, the idea of coexistence. But the idea of tribes as non-caste society remain as it is. And I should say that these concepts comes, after the writings of Professor Virginas Kaka, which in fact starting from 1990s, early 1990s, I don't know whether I answered your question or I confused you more.
May I ask a question, Dr. Ziipao?
Sure. Yes, please.
Yeah. Yeah, so I would actually like to know a bit more about, obviously I've heard certain things about this, but could you elaborate more on before and after Khaka? What is the before and after Khaka? For others who don't know Dr. Virginis Khaka, he's one of the prominent sociologists from India. And, he's also been, in fact, he's also been the committee head of Dr. Virginis Khaka Committee on Tribal Socio-Economic Development in India. So I was just asking Dr. Ziipao as to what does before and after Khaka mean?
Well, that is the kind of framework which we at the Tribal Intellectual Collective India form in the context of how do we understand the question of tribes? How has tribes been terrorized before the writings of Professor Virginis Khaka? For instance, in the pre-Khaka, tribes has been terrorized mostly in the transformation of tribes. Also look into the transformation. How much tribes have become castes? And also caste society is being seen as the dominant, and whereas the tribes as on the periphery aspects. And the pre-Khaka people have been terrorized tribes as outside the states and civilizations. So the question which we ask here, does this mean that tribes doesn't have their own civilization? Does it mean that tribes doesn't have the vision, doesn't have a concept of development, doesn't have a concept of the modernity? Or are we just a part of this caste society? So if we are the part of this caste society, if tribes is transformed itself into a caste society, which caste, which category, where do we place in that Varna systems? Whether tribes will be accepted as a Brahmins, whether tribes will be accepted as a Kshatriya, Vaishyas, and so on and so forth. So here we realize that there is something fundamentally wrong in that trying to. No, I'm not trying to say fundamentally wrong, but as this perspective is in fact not very close to the kind of reality which we are, experiencing. We experience our reality from someone else's shadow. So this is where the concept like the pre and the post Khaka comes into the place. Especially after the writings, after the assertions of Professor Virginis Khaka, you can find, some of his writings in EPW, and one of the key texts which I always follow is this book, Khaka's book, State, Society and Tribe, Issues in Post-Colonial India. This is like, whenever I have any confusion and doubt in terms of the tribe, I always come back to this book. That is where he gave us a category. Tribe is not just a mere cultural entity where people are just good in dancing and singing, whatnot, all the other aspect. No, tribes more than that. That is what we mean. Are there alternative ways to look at it? So in fact, Khaka called it, tribes are experiencing a double forms of colonialism. So for us, we are put it not only double, but there's a waves of colonialism taking place. These waves of colonialism, for instance, stems from the first, it was the British who colonized, then the non-tribal, then comes also the waves of these new liberal development policies. And no doubt one also has to remember that even among the tribes, the way how these dominant tribes try to subsume other smaller tribes, within that also can be forms of colonialisms or colonialism by discourse, the way how people have theorized on the question of tribe and, influencing in the very idea of the knowledge production. So here we also look into what is called the alternative path to modernity and say, I wanted to elaborate a little bit on the concepts of governance. So here people in this post-Khaka, we talks about this engaged governance. On contrary, what is called this good governance. So framed from the tribal people's participation and on engaged governance, rather than one imposed and defined by the so-called dominant society and the caste-centric states on tribes. So engaged governance is where tribal people are perceived not only as equal, but as capable for self-governance without being anti-state. I think this is important, or without being anti-nationals. So the engaged governance framework is premised on this mutual respect, effective safeguards, shared responsibility, peace, and also non-intrusive relationships and equitable partnerships in development. This is where we try to look at, say, for instance, the post-Kaka framework of understanding tribes and all the questions of development. Often tribes are also being perceived as anti-development or anti-nationals. Whenever they protest, for instance, my protest against this mining, protest against hydropower project, protest against this life centuries. Why tribes are protesting is as such that tribes per se are not anti-development. But what they are arguing, like I wanted to bring to the arguments of Kaka, what they are arguing is that we don't want this kind of development that displaces our land. We don't want development that this empower our community. We want development that empowers us, wherein we are also an equitable part of the partnership of that very development process. That's where we try to look about in terms of pre and post Kaka framework to understand tribe. So if I echo this very framework in the context of tribal studies in Northeast India, it also reveals a very interesting terrain for theorizations. The very question of development, construction of dams, numbers of dams in Arunachal Pradesh and also in Manipur, and the kind of ethnic conflict. So for instance, I look at, in my context, in my research, I took the category of infrastructure, started asking the question, why in tribal areas there is a poverty and crumbling of infrastructure as compared to other parts of the country, or as compared to other parts of the districts which are predominantly inhabited by the non-tribal society? Why is there roads which are not motorable? Why are there hospitals, this primary health center without nurses, doctors, and the bank without banking, schools without a roof for teachers or students? So these are the questions I try to also ask, and it goes this what we call this post-Kaka framework.
Excuse me, sir. I would like to ask a question personally, and I don't want to offend anyone here, but just a question about conflict. There are conflicts between tribes as well. So, do you think that these conflicts are leading to these are the reasons why we are not developing to the fast pace, or do you think this can be a reason?
Okay, anyone would like to answer that? Or in fact, conflict is part and parcel of human society. If we look at historically, there has been a conflict all the time. And no doubts about it, there is a conflict among tribes, conflict within the tribe, conflict within even the village, in terms of land, in terms of resources. But that doesn't mean that because of conflict, these things A is not happening, B is not happening. So if you look at conflict also, one can also see, for instance, if you ask me, say, look at the concept of conflict theory by Karl Marx. But here, forget, I'll not go in deep as such, but stay tuned, in the context of tribes. One of the famous ethnic conflict, I must say, is between Nagas and Kukis. That stems from Manipur, Why is that conflict? The conflict stems from a small town called Moray. That the Moray town is known for this, it is also known as international markets, wherein the foreign products comes in, via Moray. And why is that conflict stems? Who has the right to control our resources or imposition tax? And it again leads to further escalated to ethnic questions. The competed interest between two, say, insurgent groups led to the larger ethnic conflict. Conflict is very much, of course, we can also see about one of the stumbling blocks of development. But that is not the sole reasons why certain places are not developing. For instance, I look at the reasons, some of the factors or the challenges in terms of development in places like Northeast or in places like, in Indo-Myanmar border. You will be shocked to know that there are 4 international trade centers in Nagaland state alone. They're Indo-Myanmar border. But the roads to those international trade centers are not motorable. I did a field work in this Pangsha village in Mon district. I was shocked to learn that international trade center, it's just two dilapidated buildings. And and the concerns of the two nation state is on territorializations rather than developing the areas. What the government of India and the government of Myanmar is doing, the fencings of these international boundaries. And there's a quite a very interesting example, the one of the chief village dines in Myanmar but sleeps in India. His house is in such a way that divided in the middle of it. So how do one really try to understand that? So I think the conflict between the tribes, the conflict between, among villages, it's far, the kind of conflicts which the nation state, the conflict in terms of development projects, far more than that of the conflict within the state, also is between the tribes or among tribes. So here, one need to also understand the political economy of development in terms of identifying the priorities. So you look at the example of why this look east policy. Of course, this present government has re-Christians as egg east policy. So we have looked northeast enough. Now is the time we should start acting on it, And what are the priorities which has been identified in terms of this egg east policy? Building this, for instance, the trilateral highways, building the relations with Southeast Asia, building the trade connection between Southeast Asia and that of India. But the question is that is Northeast India going to act as only the gateway to passage to Southeast Asia that facilitate the transportation of the capital from one part of the country to other countries, So here we need to really ask these questions. And also the issue of securitizations, the issue of militarizations. No doubt about it, there are conflict within the tribes. But I think conflict is inevitable in that aspects.
So, one question that while explaining, you mentioned that there's not just one path of achieving modernity, but there are alternatives to it as well. So, if you could explain that part a little bit more.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, to begin with, modernity in whose sense? Modernity in whose lens? When I echo this alternative part to modernity, where we are also arguing that that is not the only way of looking at modernity. Tribes are also equally clamping through changing our society towards that modernity. So here, an alternative part to modernity is as like experienced by the societies inclusive of tribes as against a singular part to modernity as defined and experienced by the dominant communities. Say, for instance, if we look at about, is there only one way to look at modernity? Can we judge another civilization based on your civilizations? Say, for instance, the colonial anthropologist or the colonial administrator comes anthropologist. The way they studied tribes, the way they studied Nagas, the way they title us the half-naked Nagas, or the way they term the Nagas are the headhunters. So here I argue that Nagas were never headhunters. It's not just one fine morning you wake up and you go and, chop off someone else's head and brings back as a form of game. That's not a game. In terms, if we look at about two warring tribes, and I wanted to connect it to the concept of conflict. Why do one brings back the enemy's head during that aspects? So there are various rituals associated in that aspects. So when one judge another's community or another society based on some certain locations, say the very concept of development, the very concept of modernity, that gives a very wrong connotations. So here, what we argue is that tribes are also changing. Tribes like we are also not like what we were 20 years back or like 100 years back or 50 years back. We are also moving towards what we call, for the betterments. And also the concepts of development might be very different from the tribal perspective as compared to like the way how state conceive development, how colonial anthropologists or colonial administrator conceive development. That's what we try to link into it. There is no singular path to modernity, but there are many ways, to look at the very concepts of modernity in itself. And I don't know, there is also interesting debate coming on the very usage of the category Adivasi and tribes, particularly in Northeast India. So I am a tribe. I belong to Puma Naga tribes. But in Northeast, people prefer to use the category tribes rather than that of Adivasi. So how do we theoretically try to understand this very category? Can anybody take a guess? Why is that different category, tribes and Adivasi?
Dr. Ziipao, I was trying to actually understand this for a longer period of time, and what I actually, in fact, through my fieldworks, I actually got to know that it is that the people from the Northeast, they demean this specific term. They see this as a pejorative term. Adivasi basically means indigenous, all right? Adi and Vasi, pehle ke Vasi hai. So they see this as a pejorative term. The Northeast people in the Northeast, they see that as a pejorative term, and therefore do not or would not like to refer themselves as Adivasis, rather tribes or maybe scheduled tribes. I just correct me if I'm wrong, sir.
Yeah, in fact, you are right. In fact, if you look at scheduled tribe, ST is, what we can look at it more from the administrative point of view, political administrative aspects. But the moment we use the category Adivasi or the category tribe, it's an analytical category. It is a sociological category. But in the context of, Adivasi or the category tribes, in the context of Northeast, Bodhi, Sankupa Rani, in fact, has beautifully penned down. He was arguing that he brought up that the category, the usage, each context asserting a particular identity like Adivasi, indigenous people, or tribe. It's about negotiate the concrete conditions with the powerful others. So the usage and the employment of these identity constructs are greatly dependent on a tribe or a tribe's concrete political epistemological conditions. So he was bringing that in geographies where tribal communities experience greater degree of peripheralization. The struggle is often posited around, radical categories of resistance, such as Adivasi or indigenous. So in places where community or communities have greater control over their polity, the category tribe is often being used. So all these three identity constructs have their own epistemological source and are politically situated, these similarly with the Indian state. So the way one uses these very categories has also a political connotations in terms of the greater controls. So if we compare between the Northeast and that of the other parts of India in terms of the tribal area inhabitants, the kind of displacements which, say, tribals from Chota Nagpur region or other parts experience much greater than that of those tribes in Northeast. And tribes like in Northeast Nagas assert political rights, self-determinations, So at least they have some sort of greater control in terms of the political aspects. So if we look at theoretically, one can also look from that aspects of that dimension here. And please remember that there are tribes who are listed as scheduled castes in other part of the state, and they are not listed in some other place. Say, for instance, in the context of Assam, certain tribes are being listed as scheduled tribes in Jharkhand or West Bengal, but they are not necessarily they have been listed or recognized as a scheduled tribe in the context of Assam.
Are there any more questions?
Very informative lecture. Very nice. I think our students have really gained a lot of knowledge. Even there are certain things which I didn't know, so I feel it's really good. Any other questions, girls? Thank you.
Dr. Ziipao, are you in a position to actually share that video so that we can play? I think your internet connection is a bit unstable. Would you like to send it over to us so that quickly we can kind of share? Dr. Ziipao, can you hear us? That video that you were saying that you wanted to show, you wanted to share, could you share that with us?
Again, it's our yes. I put a link into the message. Can you hear me?
Yes. So probably, yeah. Okay, great. Maybe I can just share this, maybe, no?
I thought I'll play this video where Professor Kaka also singing a song. So Professor Kaka, Professor Bipin Jojo, they're all part of this, this singing of the song.
Is my screen visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
गाँव छोड़ब नहीं, जंगल छोड़ब नहीं, माई माटी छोड़ब नहीं, लड़ाई छोड़ब नहीं। गाँव छोड़ब नहीं, जंगल छोड़ब नहीं, माई माटी छोड़ब नहीं, लड़ाई छोड़ब नहीं, हाँ लड़ाई छोड़ब नहीं। गाँव छोड़ब नहीं, जंगल छोड़ब नहीं, माई माटी छोड़ब नहीं, लड़ाई छोड़ब नहीं। गाँव छोड़ब नहीं, जंगल छोड़ब नहीं, माई माटी छोड़ब नहीं, लड़ाई छोड़ब नहीं, हाँ लड़ाई छोड़ब नहीं। बांध बनाए, गाँव डुबाए, कारखाना बनाए, जंगल काटे, खादन कोड़े, सेंचुरी बनाए। बांध बनाए, गाँव डुबाए, कारखाना बनाए, जंगल काटे, खादन कोड़े, सेंचुरी बनाए। जब जंगल जमीन छोड़ी, हमें कहाँ कहाँ जाए। विकास के भगवान बता, हम कैसे जान बचाए, हाँ हाँ कैसे जान बचाए। गाँव छोड़ब नहीं, जंगल छोड़ब नहीं, माए माटी छोड़ब नहीं, लड़ाई छोड़ब नहीं। गाँव छोड़ब नहीं, जंगल छोड़ब नहीं, माए माटी छोड़ब नहीं, लड़ाई छोड़ब नहीं, हाँ लड़ाई छोड़ब नहीं। थे क्या मूर्ख जो जंगल को बचाए। धरती रखी हरी भरी, नदी मधु बहाए। मूर्ख थे क्या मूर्ख जो वो जंगल को बचाए। धरती रखी हरी भरी, नदी मधु बहाए। तेरी हवस में जल गई धरती, लुट गई हरियाली। मछली मर गई, पंछी उड़ गई, जाने किस दिशाए, हाँ हाँ जाने किस दिशाए। बिस्तर पुकारे एकजुट होवे, छोड़ो ये खामोशी। मछुआरे आओ, दलित आओ, आओ आदिवासी। बिस्तर पुकारे एकजुट होवे, छोड़ो ये खामोशी। मछुआरे आओ, दलित आओ, आओ आदिवासी। वो खेत खलिहान से जगो, नगाड़ा बजाओ,
लड़ाई छोड़ी चरा नहीं, सुनो देशवासी, हाँ हाँ सुनो देशवासी। गाँव छोड़ब नहीं, जंगल छोड़ब नहीं, माए माटी छोड़ब नहीं, लड़ाई छोड़ब नहीं। गाँव छोड़ब नहीं, जंगल छोड़ब नहीं, माए माटी छोड़ब नहीं, लड़ाई छोड़ब नहीं, लड़ाई छोड़ब नहीं।
Yeah, this was the video song I wanted to play, and so we can all listen in the way how it struck me, the way of the conceptualizing the very concept of development, also in the modernity, and you could see different poster placards being played. So what really struck me is, without land, water, and forest, where do we go? That is a fundamental question. So it also remember recollect the indigenous people from not from America. Towards the end, we fight for the land, not all what is going on. But towards the end, it is we who belongs to the earth, not the earth that belongs to us. So here, similarly, in the context of this, in the tribes, the various development projects, various factories, displacing thousands of tribals. So the songs, in fact, provides us what's really going on in the tribal society, the current stage of development. And also there are quite good number of, the cover song was sung by the T students, Adivasi student from T Tata Institute of Social Science Bombay. Here Professor Virginia Kaka was also actively taking part in that aspect. Also I thought would invoke some interest. But nevertheless, we could discuss only on this song for, deliberates upon it in terms of the very questions of development that disempower certain communities like tribes.
Indeed, it was a very beautiful video. I assume that there are no further questions, so we wrap this up. Thank you so much for this very informative and interesting session, sir. And I render the platform now to Kim.
I would like to extend my thanks further to Sir and the audience for the questions. It was a really informative session, and I'm sure the audience, including me, have learned a lot from this session. And now with this, we have come to the end of our session. And now I would like to call upon Magani, who is our Vice President of the Society, to give a vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Kim, for giving me this opportunity. Good afternoon to all. I deem it a great honor and privilege to propose a vote of thanks on this productive webinar. First and foremost, I'd like to thank our special guest, Dr.Raile Rocky Ziipao, for enlightening us with all the amazing session, and our convener, Dr. Gurmeet Bakshi, and our faculty advisor, Mrs. Bipasha Rosie Lakra, for guiding us throughout amidst our busy schedule. Our president, Ruth J. Lalrampui, for the effort she has put up in assembling every members of the society and encouraging them throughout. And also, nonetheless, I would like to thank the core team members for all the support and the hard work they have put up to propose this webinar. And nonetheless, I would like to thank all the present attendees today for cooperating with us throughout. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you so much, and I wish you all the very best for your future endeavors.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ziipao. Thank you so much. We'll see you soon sometime, sir. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. It could have been much better had we had the offline interaction, rather than this online, but the situation put us in this manner.
Absolutely, absolutely, sir. Sometime we'll do that, sir. We'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.